Welcome to another episode of Just One More Fix. This is James. With me in this episode is Lacey.
Hey.
You can find us online at justonemorefix.com or on Twitter at justonemorefix. If you like us, head over to iTunes or to Google Play and give us a rating and a comment. In this episode, we're going to talk about early mental health treatments and horror.
Bum, bum, bum.
And now, it's time to get our gaming fix.
I'm Chris.
I'm Neil.
And I'm Stargate Pioneer, and we're the hosts of the Starling Tribune podcast.
A podcast member of the Gonna Geek Network.
Just like the show you're listening to now.
The opinions expressed are those of each individual.
Check out all the other podcasts
At GonnaGeekNetwork.com.
And get ready.
because geekiness begins in
3,
2.
1.
Welcome to another episode of Just One More Fix. So as you heard, we are going to talk about some pretty primitive mental health treatments. But before we do that, a couple quick announcements here. First off, our work on the Patreon continues, and it should be scheduled to go up October 20th. That's on a couple Fridays from now. So just keep your eyes open for that, and I'll link that on justonemorefix.com. In addition, if you live in the Midwest, somewhere near Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, we are going to plan to do a couple remote podcasts, so we may be coming to a gaming store near you. So we'll blast those out on Twitter, Facebook, and we'll mention them here on the podcast as well. The plan is to do some live recording, and if you guys want to come out and support us and maybe, I don't know, shoot some strange gaming questions you might be curious about our opinion on or anything, if you just want to come out and hang out with us and maybe play some games and put a name to a face for listening to us for however long you've been with us for, we will be there. So we're looking forward to doing that and getting out and seeing you guys. And
Also, if you think your gaming store is worthy of our amazing presence, feel free to send us a comment or message us and let us know, hey, come to my town. My gaming store is the best in all the land, and we'll maybe come out and
Right.
check that out.
depending on how far away you are and whatnot. So Lacey, if they were going to do that, how would they reach us?
Why, I believe all our contact information can be found at justonemorefix.com.
Right on. So you can email me, James at justonemorefix.com, or you can direct message me on Twitter, or if you join our Facebook group, you can find us on there as well. And the final announcement is Halloween is our favorite holiday here, and
That's true.
and fall is our favorite time of year as well. So
Also true.
for the month of October and maybe into November, one episode, because we missed one episode in October, we're going to be horror themed. So you may notice that by the theme of today's episode and the upcoming episodes down the road, we're going to do some horror themed stuff and try and improve your horror gaming and maybe give you some ideas about bringing horror elements into other games that you already have that you may not normally think of being a horror game or whatever. And we're going to talk about some of that today with what we're into today. And also our reviews this month will be horror themed reviews. Just happened to be that Bluebeard's Bride won our, what do you call that?
Poll.
Poll. Wow, that lost that word there for a minute there. So Bluebeard's Bride won our poll, and it's obviously a horror game, really cool horror game that we like quite a bit. Spoiler alert, I guess. And we will be reviewing it, and that should be coming out in the next couple weeks. Just depends on how the editing and recording schedule goes for that one. I think that's all the announcements. Today we're going to talk about some pretty barbaric mental health treatments that used to take place quite a ways back, and some not so far back. So for
And
those of you
some
that...
still happening today.
Yeah, and so for those of you that don't know, mental health, me and Lacey both work in the healthcare world. We're both emergency medical professionals. Is that a right way to say that?
It feels very formal.
Right. We both work in emergency medicine. So I'm a paramedic and she's an ER nurse, and we've both been working in the emergency field for quite some time now. We're grizzled veterans at this point, I think you might call us, in terms of emergency medicine anyway.
Disillusioned and bitter
Yeah,
is the terms I would choose.
So the first off, small disclaimer, I guess, actually not even small, and a big disclaimer on this one. Mental health is a very, very big real issue that we have in the U.S. and around the world, and we don't do a very good job of taking care of mental health patients. Just the way the system is structured doesn't do a very good job of it. So
It's more than just the system, too. You're talking about just a group of people that in general is especially when you're talking about severe mental illness, which is where a lot of these treatments come into play. You're talking about a very vulnerable population that isn't really able to voice things in the same way.
Right. They're not able to advocate for themselves in the way that most patients can. So it's not to make light of that, but there is a lot of inspiration to take from things from the past. And unfortunately, a lot of these treatments are barbaric, but in a lot of ways, the lessons that we have learned in medicine from the past is what has gotten us to more modern medicine. So we don't want to dwell on it or make light of the issue, but just wanted to mention that, and we're going to jump right into it here. So we picked some of our more inspiring, I don't know, more
I don't
dark.
feel like favorite is the right term for
Right.
what we're discussing
You're
here.
right.
But
More compelling.
most brutal?
Right. Mental health treatments. So do you just want to go back and forth?
I think that works.
Right on. Well, go ahead. You can go first.
Okay.
What's your first one?
Number one?
Or wait, are you going to go from like least horrifying to most horrifying, or how do you want to do this?
I was just going to go with most popular.
Okay. I'm going to go with horrifying.
And then I was going to throw kind of the least popular in the middle so I didn't end on a weak note.
All right, right on. Sounds good.
Okay, so number one for me, easy decision, lobotomy.
Right.
For sure. I feel like this treatment gets a lot of sort of pop culture gravitas.
Right.
Basically what's happening, it's not a complete removal of a section of the brain. It is a severing of that lobe's connections to the other lobes. So what
Specifically
that
the frontal
means,
lobe.
yeah, for the most part, you're talking about the frontal lobe when you're
Assuming
talking
they
about a
get
lobotomy.
the ice pick in
Especially
the
when
right-
you're talking about mental... Wait,
I'm
don't
sorry.
steal
I'm sorry.
my thunder.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Especially when you're talking about mental health treatment, you're talking about severing the brain's connections from the prefrontal cortex to the thalamus. What you're looking at there is a lot of impulse control issues. This was originally done as like a sort of a last resort only for very severe patients. And then the 1940s happened.
Right.
And you see a guy, I'm presuming he's a doctor, so his name would be Dr. Moniz, M-O-N-I-Z. I don't know if I'm saying that right. But he actually wins a Nobel Prize in 1949 for his
No.
lobotomy technique. I
Wow.
promise you.
Well, I've got a Nobel Prize winner as well. Interesting.
So he is the man who is responsible for shortcutting the lobotomy, if you will, having I don't know if you want to call it a mini lobotomy, but he takes it from the whole removing a section of skull, cracking you open and severing ties to actually taking an ice pick. And it's not really any more medical than that. It looks like an ice pick. It is an ice pick, jamming it through your eye socket, penetrating the bone behind your eye socket, and basically kind of scrabbling your frontal lobe with a spatula.
So they like follow the optic nerve in through the...
Yeah.
Is that how they do it?
I'm assuming. I don't know.
So the easiest way to imagine that is if you go to the corner of your eye. This is really creepy to me because I have a pretty severe eye injury, but they would stick the ice pick in, kind of like where your tear duct is, essentially, like right there at that corner of your eye, and just slide it in, ideally following your optic nerve because that goes back through the bone that separates your face from your brain, basically, and then shove it in there with all the grace and precision that the 1940s had, right? And just wiggle it around? I mean, how does that...
That's pretty much what it sounds like to me. He perfected this procedure and actually did over 3,000 of them.
Wow.
Yeah. So
And that's one guy?
That's one guy, over 3,000 procedures in his career.
Jeez.
This was done mainly
Go
for
big or
people
go home,
with
right?
schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder, particularly the kind with manic episodes, because those are a little bit less manageable than depression, as
Right.
you would kind of assume from the description.
Right.
The idea of this was to induce a state of calm.
It's calm because you can't make a decision to do.
However, for some patients, it worked initially and then they would have relapses. For other patients, it had the opposite of the intended effect. For some patients, it did work, I guess you would say, but with significant side effects like a complete loss of motivation to do anything.
Right.
And then not to mention the patients that, of course, died or developed infections and then died as a result of
Yeah,
that.
because as it turns out, 1940s was not the best time for sterilization processes, I imagine.
So I'm going to say the number one place that you're going to see this in pop culture. This is an older movie, but the best example is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Jack Nicholson's character McMurphy in the end of the film gets a lobotomy after his feud with Nurse Ratched. His friend is actually so, I don't know if you want to say like taken aback, but he recognizes that this is basically no longer McMurphy's character and certainly not how he would have wanted to live his existence, and smothers him with a pillow.
Right on. Yeah.
And that is how that film ends. I don't feel like I need to say spoiler alert. I mean,
it's one of Jack Nicholson's early movies. So it's from the 70s.
But it is a really amazing film
movie.
Set inside this mental health hospital, and you see this interesting dynamic between all of the patients and staff that work there as they battle back and forth, particularly between McMurphy and Nurse Ratched, as they kind of vie for power and
well, it's a great example
prestige.
too if you want to portray some kind of 1960s, and I think you could probably take that institution, the way that it's portrayed, all the way back to the 50s and maybe into the 40s, of how a mental health institution works in the hierarchies of authority and power structure, especially between like the staff with the nurses, orderlies, and doctors, and how they relate to the patients. There's a lot of inspiration to draw from if you want to use that as like in a Call of Cthulhu or Trail of Cthulhu game of how things work in a mental institution. One thing you didn't mention, which I don't know if you saw this or not, but lobotomies actually used to be used as a treatment for severe alcoholism, which is a crazy thing to think. That's where the phrase, "I'd rather have a bottle in front of me than a frontal lobotomy," comes from, because they actually lobotomized a whole bunch of severe alcoholics, because if they lost connection to their frontal lobe, then they would not have the desire to drink anymore.
Well, it's fascinating because legitimately in the 1940s, it becomes like a marketing campaign. Like there is initially very little research about, one, the results of it initially, short-term results, and then two, long-term effects. There's basically no studies at all.
Right.
But then they're like, it becomes like the new fad treatment for mental illness, which is absolutely insane.
Well, to be fair to the 1940s, medical studies and research weren't exactly at the peak at that point either.
Right. Evidence-based medicine is not a thing, which I think is probably a strong point for all of these things that we're about to talk about.
Right.
It's sort of like, oh, okay, well, I tried it on these 6 patients and 4 of them didn't die,
Right.
and 3 of those 4 were better.
We'll
and
call that a success.
that's a significant enough statistical pool for me to base my entire practice on 6 patients.
Right on. So is there any gaming inspiration that you can come up with that like to incorporate the idea of lobotomized patients into your games?
I think that it is a cool thing just from the horror aspect, because when you talk about the frontal cortex, you're talking about your personality base, your decisions. So I think for me, it becomes a really interesting thing to like threaten with.
Right.
You know what I mean? So you see like in Penny Dreadful,
Right.
where Violet comes, just basically out, minutes away from being lobotomized. It's a cool thing in it's not just like a physical form of damage. It's a point of no return as far as an assault on your basic personality and core beliefs goes.
Right, because you're not going to die. You're just going to
You're just going to
evaporate
cease to
and-
be the
yeah.
person that you were before.
Right. That's very cool. There's a lot of horror in that, and that could easily be taken into almost any kind of genre, all the way from fantasy all the way on into science fiction
There's
style
an
stuff.
excellent version of it in the sci-fi universe when you look at the TV series Westworld, because when you look at what they're doing to the artificial intelligence creatures in that show,
Oh, right.
that's basically what they're doing. And you see it in the character Clementine, who is one of the whores at the whorehouse, basically, and she becomes a problem, and they basically set her up
Right.
to take a fall to try and shift things at the park, but they lobotomize
Yeah.
her AI character, and you see how she is still functional and still able to follow orders, but there is no longer any higher level of thought that is within that shell.
Right. Right on. Right on. Anything else on lobotomies?
No, I think that's pretty much that's my summary of
Right
the
on.
topic.
So my first one is chemically induced seizures. So this one is kind of weird. So way back when, they did not seem to believe that schizophrenics had seizure disorders, that it was sort of two ends of a spectrum. You either had a seizure disorder or a schizophrenic disorder, and most of the population was somewhere in the middle. So if you had schizophrenia, they would induce seizures in you, and that would cure your schizophrenia because it would slide you more towards the middle of what this spectrum that they thought that existed.
That makes perfect sense.
Which, unfortunately, in reality, schizophrenics are actually 8 times more likely to have a seizure disorder. With modern statistics, we know now that this was, in fact, a terrible idea. So they did this a couple different ways. There's a couple different medications that they used. Camptor oil, which is something I don't really know what that is, but they also use cardiazol and metrazole. Do you know either one of those two meds or no?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. Yeah, didn't ring a bell to me. So, but
it's not. I don't routinely induce seizures, though. It's not.
So this
not generally something we aim for.
Right. This is something that you would think would come about in like the 1800s or maybe the 19 teens.
No, IVs don't even exist yet.
But this actually comes from the 1934. Is Ladislas Joseph von Meduna, if I'm saying that right. And I'm assuming he's a physician. I believe he is. He's actually the forefather of electroconvulsive therapy, if you could be a forefather of something. So this is the early form of that. And the idea being that they would induce, instead of a electrical seizure with, electricity, they would do it with, drugs. And obviously, this was not successful for nearly anyone. I don't believe there's any successful cases of causing seizures and curing medical conditions in people. So there's not a whole lot to say about this one other than they were, purposefully giving medications to people to induce seizures. And I just think that's pretty terrifying and scary. And if you've ever seen an actual seizure, there are very few medical emergencies where the average person can look at it and be like, that is not normal. Seizures are pretty scary if it's a real seizure. So I thought the idea of having a room full of seizing people, as you go into some kind of villain's lair or whatever, where they're experimenting on people, seemed pretty creepy to me, because then it becomes, do we go after the bad guy or do we try and manage this room of 15 seizing patients? And maybe what if it wasn't by IV? What if it was by gas? Because I'm sure there's lots of poisonous gases that cause seizures as well, right? Those gases are probably lethal, but I mean, in a gaming sense, you can make them do anything if you wanted to, right? So I just thought the idea of complete loss of ability to do anything and being completely immobilized by some kind of medication or factor is pretty scary, because in terms of if you're going into a bad guy's lair, right, and you're going to go do some fighting and kill the bad guys, if you know the potential of a seizure exists and you just keel over and are rendered unresponsive, essentially, how do you fight that? How do you deal with that? I'm kind of thinking like a fantasy kind of a sense. I mean, in a sci-fi world, almost anything is imaginable for what they can pump in through the air vents of a Space Hulk or a spaceship. I just thought it presented some interesting complications for how you would go about doing things if you don't have the potential to have a spacesuit or some kind of isolation protocol.
Okay. My next one is actually very similar to that. Number 2 for me is insulin shock therapy, which is probably as healthy as it sounds. So most of the lay people out there are familiar with diabetes as an issue, and so vaguely familiar with insulin. Mm-hmm. Basically, what insulin does is helps regulate the amount of sugar that your body has available to use. Your brain needs sugar to work. If it doesn't have it, it begins to shut down all functions that are not abundantly necessary for your life, up to the point of coma.
Right.
And when that fails, death.
Which is where we cue the title of this treatment.
Insulin shock therapy. So, funnily enough, this treatment was stumbled upon entirely by accident, much like Rogaine. So, in 1927, they were treating morphine addiction with insulin therapy.
Oh, wow.
They accidentally gave a patient too much and put him into a coma. And when he came to, they noticed that he was much more calm and docile individual. So they thought,
because his sugar was 40.
You know where we could really use this? On our schizophrenic patients that are just very difficult to manage. And so there you have insulin shock therapy. I don't really see any examples of this in pulp culture, but I did come up with a good story of morphine addiction, which I think is really fun, in A Young Doctor's Notebook, which has Daniel Radcliffe and the guy from Mad Men. I can't think of his name right now.
That, on a side note, that's a really good show to watch as
each
well.
Each season is only 4 episodes.
Yeah, it's a quick watch. It's easy to binge it, but it's a great example of early period doctors, physicians, and at the sort of turn of the century
medical techniques.
And medical would be in air quotes.
There's
there.
a wonderful, my absolute all-time favorite pulling a tooth scene is
right.
amazing. But the doctor in this story has a terrible morphine addiction, and so just talking about that and treatment for that and that same sort of period that you're looking at puts me in the mind of that. Now, the other reason that I think that insulin shock therapy is interesting in terms of game is you see a lot of times in like movies or TV shows where a patient is unruly and out of hand and you give them a shot of Haldol and suddenly they're manageable just like the flip of a hat.
Which is not actually a thing at all, not even close.
Even if you gave it to them through the IV, it would take
several minutes.
Several minutes, probably a good 15 to 20 minutes, and then they would start to be drowsy. It wouldn't be just like an off-on switch. Insulin, on the other hand, if you gave them a large enough dose, has the potential to be like that actual kill switch of medications. I find it interesting in that regard, in that one, your body just cannot handle that. There's no defense. I guess there's sort of an antidote with sugar, but if you gave somebody that much that fast, they wouldn't be able to eat quick enough to counteract that. So it has a lot of diabolical potential, in that regard.
Like a blowgun.
Yeah, just really like, and he's out.
Right. Actually, that's a way. On the darker side of things, I suppose, insulin is one of the ways that nurses that have killed lots of patients, the serial killer kind of, mass murder kind of nurses, have killed lots of their patients with insulin overdose. Because it's hard. At one point, it was hard to detect. Or
potassium.
Potassium is the other one. Yeah. But insulin and potassium are both the most common. But yeah.
So, yeah, there's lots of good diabolical underplots available there.
Right on. Okay, so my second one is called the Utica box, is what it's commonly known as, or the Utica crib.
This is terrifying.
So
I didn't know this was a thing before you discussed it, and I wish that I did not know it was a thing again.
So we'll link to some pictures of it. It is essentially, well, first I'll give you a background of where it comes from. In the times of 1845, it was developed in Marseille by Dr. H.M. Aubinel, I'm guessing. I don't know if that's French or if I'm saying that right, but it's Aubenel. And then eventually, a year later in 1846, it was brought to Utica, New York, at the New York State Lunatic Asylum at Utica, New York, it was used so much there, it actually got the name the Utica box there. And it was brought there by Amariah Brigham, I believe. And Amariah, I got to say, is a great villain name if you're looking for one. I think it's a fun name that's probably not used, or not even probably isn't used anymore, that I've never heard anybody with that name. But it is essentially a 18-inch deep, 6 foot long, and 3 foot wide box. And it has bars instead of like flat walls or anything in it, so you can see in it. However, they did mention in several things that I read about it where if patients were particularly unruly, in order to calm them down, they would lay a heavy blanket or tarp across the top of it to completely black out everything. And they were described as being more restrictive than a coffin. 18 inches wide isn't very tall, and it was in fact so shallow that most people couldn't even roll over inside them. So you essentially just lay flat inside this thing. And it was used for quite a while, and the one claim to fame from the medical side of things was people were very proud that it did in fact remove the necessity of using restraints on people. So whether that was leather restraints or straitjackets or the bite hoods or any of that kind of stuff, it eliminated the use of those, which I don't know what seems more barbaric, the giant straitjackets and mittens. And
listen, it's not about what's more or less barbaric. It's really just about whether or not you're meeting those special criteria that hospitals are required to.
Right.
And you're not allowed to have patients in restraint. There's all this unnecessary documentation that has to be done if that's the case. Boom, just stick them in a box. That's all I'm saying.
The fun thing about this, I guess, I don't know if fun thing about it is the right word, but these cribs, as they call them, the Utica crib, were locked closed with like a padlock, right? And the doctors didn't have the keys to them. The attendants did. So the patients were at the mercy of the attendants. And seems like if you look at most 1800s, early 1900s insane asylums, most of the common everyday abuses were performed by the, what do you call those?
Orderlies.
Yeah, most of the abuses were carried out by the orderly staff. So the orderlies are actually the ones that have the
It
keys.
makes sense when you think about it, because that's who's spending the most amount
time,
of time with these people.
Right. You're not at the mercy of the doctor in a way. You're actually at the mercy of the orderly, which is a little more scary because in this period, they're probably not even medically trained people. They're just regular people that work there. And some of them probably pretty wicked, evil, and sadistic. I'm sure there's probably good ones as well.
Well,
But
even that aside, you have the interplay of somebody that doesn't always have good impulse control,
Right.
and probably is in a situation they don't want to be in. So then you have a fair amount of manipulation. Then you have the fact that you see them every day.
Yeah.
Maybe you were out of control last week. Maybe I am still harboring a grudge about that.
Right.
I mean, there's
8 million factors that come into play.
it's a terrible, terrible set of circumstances.
And there's no oversight or very little oversight.
Right.
And more importantly, no recourse for the patients if something bad happens. I'm sure up to and including death is probably pretty forgivable. And even death at this point is probably not that big of a deal. One piece of this, I guess, is if you want to see, we'll link some pictures of these, but if you want to see what period restraints were, there's some of them that are actually pretty awful, I guess would be the right word, where they're actually standing up. They're in a position where they can't actually bend their knees. They have to stay standing and their arms are extended out with restraints and they're kind of like held to the ceiling in a way so they can't sit down. So I guess in a way this might be a little less barbaric than that, but I mean, it's pretty awful. One way I did see as a pop culture reference, if we're going to throw a shout out to one of my old favorite podcasts, which was Crash Course in Awesome, which is a great podcast. It's not being produced anymore, but a little shout out to them. They're pretty awesome. They've got some good episodes for gaming inspiration. But Blade, I'm not sure which one it's in, but there is a scene where they go into a feeding farm where they're harvesting blood off of people. And while they're shrink wrapped and kind of held in these frames, it's not the exact same thing, but they're held in restraints and they're also sedated while they're in there. But essentially, it's just racks and racks and racks of these people, right? And I thought that could be kind of a cool thing if you go into some kind of evil witch lord kind of character or an insane asylum, and you literally just have lots of these Utica boxes in an asylum. Or if you go into a dungeon or some wizard's tower and he just has loads of people sort of contained in these boxes, maybe in various levels of sedation or charm spells or whatever.
It puts me in the mind of fairy tales. Like it's very Hansel and Gretel.
Yeah.
You know, when he's trapped in there and the whole chicken bone thing.
Right.
It's like trying to feed him to fatten him up. Like
Right.
once you fill up the box, then it's time for me to eat you.
Right. So there's a lot of potential because you're completely restrained and at the mercy of whoever has you in there. Also, if you have players that I'm not a big fan of games that start off with the premise being where the players are captured, but if you really want to put some shock and horror into your players, if the initial part of their imprisonment is in one of these Utica boxes or Utica cribs, it could be really effective and terrifying as they realize how 100% and completely helpless they are. So there's a lot of cool psychological horror you could bring to players. And that's in any kind of genre, whether that's fantasy all the way through modern day horror. And actually, even sci-fi, you could have them in some kind of like a stasis field or something. You don't actually have to have a physical box. That's what I like about some of these things is trying to take the concepts that make them so terrifying and then extrapolate them forward into a different kind of a thing that still has the same results. So, right on. You want to do your third one there?
So the third one is probably my favorite, honestly. So exorcism as a treatment for mental health disorders.
Which sadly is still a thing today.
Yeah, I was just going to say it probably is scariest to me because it is still a thing today. And you think this may be, oh, well, you know, in third world countries that aren't as settled as we are here. No. I had a textbook recently for a college course written by a nurse with an advanced degree who felt that exorcism was a legitimate treatment for
Mental
demon
health
possession.
Is this for your nurse practitioner?
Yes, it is. So,
Wow. Okay. Moving along.
yeah. So when you're talking about exorcism, some of the classic things you're really looking at are sort of these like delusions of grandeur, right? Because you're thinking a form of self-importance,
Right.
strong religious undertones, obviously. You might be looking at speaking in tongues, which is really sort of like speaking in gibberish or kind of switching back and forth between languages or something to that effect. Paranoia is a big thing, but you're also seeing some negative effects, like no longer caring for yourself, no longer eating, no longer seeing after basic needs. So basically what you take when you roll all of that together and throw in some hallucinations is a very serious schizophrenic episode. And so now you're trying to treat that by tying a patient down and screaming things at them, basically,
Right.
and, you know, compelling the devil to come out of them. And, you know, I don't know if I want to put everybody's religion on blast, but I'm just going to say that I don't feel like any of that is warranted or justified. So I think what's really neat, though, is in the movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose that did really well. You see the actual interplay in that movie between religion and medical treatment that you don't get in like the original Exorcist movie. So in this, she's being treated by a physician and she's taking these medications, and it turns out like, okay, well, these medications are the things that are preventing the exorcism from working or whatever. So you see this battle between modern medicine and old school religious fervor, which I think is really, really interesting how they put that in there. I also like it in the sci-fi genre. So you see this in the movie, or not in the movie, but in the TV show Firefly, when you see River Tam and her brother Sam get kidnapped by this society that believes in religion, and they label,
they're gonna burn her as a witch.
they label her as a witch because that is their religion, and she has these powers that aren't explained by what they believe. And she definitely has, you know, some kind of mental illness from all of the brain poking that has been happening there. Sort of lobotomy again with her, but in a different form. So you see it again in that sci-fi genre as well. So I really like the play between, like I said, the modern medical scientific based treatment and then the spiritual faith based treatment. And I think that's a cool thing to draw on in games, this sort of kind of polar opposites fighting against each other. And I think it's even more interesting if you try and trap your player in between those two. So maybe you know that, like, okay, you're playing a game with me. You're going to dangle this scientific treatment for what I have going on, but maybe there's such a societal pressure or cultural pressure in the world that you're in, or in this village that you're in, that suddenly that's not a good thing anymore. And the people of that village are trying to enforce this other thing on you that's going to make you worse. So I think that's an interesting thing to pull on.
Well, I think it's a cool thing to pull threads on as well in a fantasy, because in most fantasy worlds, you have priests with actual powers, right? Like they can actually exorcise real demons. That's an actual thing. But what if they go to exorcise a person and it turns out that they literally are just schizophrenic, but the players seem to think that they are possessed by whatever the evil god is in your world, Vecna or Takesis or whoever it is, you know, that could be a cool thing to play on and see how they do with that. As well, also, one of the cool themes of exorcism is the thought of it is a loss of control of yourself to something that is external from you, right? I think you could also think of this in terms of maybe zombie is a little too simplified, but any kind of external thing that's going to take away your sense of self, right? Whether that's a disease or an alien presence, or in a sci-fi sense where you're actually physically like jacked into the matrix, right? Whether that's, you know, wirelessly or whatever, and the AI is taking you over in a way. So how does a tech priest in a way, or, you know, the hacker exercise the AI from you because you have, you know, microchips or whatever inside your body that,
So you're talking
you know,
about possession.
Yeah. You know, and it's still the same exact thing, you know, in it just like a drastically different spin on it, you know, and it's kind of neat to think that you can watch movies like The Exorcism or Exorcism of Emily Rose, or all these ones, The Conjuring, all these ones that have these really creepy, cool, scary exorcism scenes in it, right? And take that as inspiration and then push that into a sci-fi game where you're trying to exorcise an AI out of somebody. And while the techniques might be slightly different, the themes are the exact same. And I think you might find a way to shock your players by using those themes from those kind of movies that are very scary in a sci-fi sense, because they're not going to see that coming, I don't think.
I think that really opens a good opportunity in a dark heresy sort of setting.
I was just thinking
Where-
about 40K.
Yeah, where you have that your imperator, or is that what it's called? Emperor, sorry, is basically like your god in that setting.
Right.
And you have sort of the chaos and corruption.
Right.
And then you have like your tech priests, and you have all this high tech implants and things of that nature. And I think you could have a lot of fun messing around with that idea
Yeah.
in that world.
Well, it's very cool because when you put things into a content and into a world where the evil is actually manifested in the world. Now in 40K, the powers of chaos are much more overt than the powers of the Emperor, right? The clerics of the Emperor have some powers, but chaos is very, very powerful. It corrupts you. You grow third arms and horns and all kinds of stuff, right? It's kind of hard to argue against exorcism in that case, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a cool way to play on that and to just, I guess, watch those movies for inspiration and draw those into your games where you have some sort of infestation or corruption mechanic, and using that as a guide for how scary that can be, sort of losing the self to this otherworldly power.
Right.
Right on. All right, so was that your last one?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so my final one is one that I found to be really weird in a lot of ways, but kind of in a darker sense makes a lot of sense. So mine is called malaria therapy, which you would think malaria therapy shouldn't even be a thing that occurred to anyone at any point in history.
You mean like therapeutically treating malaria, right?
No. In fact, it's exactly the opposite of that. So, fun fact about malaria for those of you that don't know, it's actually estimated that malaria has killed half of the people who have ever lived on the earth, which is kind of hard to fathom. But yeah, killed half of the people, not that have like are alive now, but have ever lived on the earth ever. So it's good at killing people. It's really good at killing people, I guess you should say. So syphilis was a big problem for a long, long time until the invention of penicillin. So in modern times, syphilis is just treated with penicillin, and you take some medicine and hopefully it goes away.
You mean that debauchery is an ongoing human problem?
Yes, as it turns out. Yeah. So syphilis has some weird psychological symptoms as the disease progresses, and it goes kind of far along. You can start to manifest all kinds of neurologic symptoms like, delusions of grandeur, dementia, paralysis, all kinds, basically all of your classic schizophrenia symptoms.
So quick
essentially.
rundown on syphilis for those of you that are just like, oh, well, that's an STD. How is that relevant? So syphilis happens in stages with remission periods. So you get it, goes away. You get it, it goes away. Every time you have you get it period, it gets significantly worse. So it starts with just like a sore on your genitals because it's an STD. And then it goes away. Maybe you don't get it checked out. You're like, I don't know.
It went away. It's all better now.
I
must be good.
And then it comes back, and all of a sudden you have sores sort of everywhere. That's not good, right? I don't know. Maybe I'll give it a few weeks and we'll just see what happens. Oh, and they go away again. Oh, I'm all good.
It's like magic.
And then it comes back the third time, and now you have what's called tertiary syphilis, which is basically stage 3. And it gets, again, significantly worse. So this is where you're seeing, all of a sudden I'm losing my hair. I'm losing my teeth. I'm going a little bit crazy. And
Or a
so
lot crazy.
That's how we get to the mental health syphilis stage.
So this is pretty far down the syphilis rabbit hole,
Yeah.
I guess you could say. But it is a deceptive disease in that the symptoms manifest and then they kind of subside and they come back. So the disease actually never goes away in your body. The symptoms do in a way, right? Well, now it's treated with penicillin, and it's relatively easy to take care of. And syphilis is not, it's very rare essentially now in modern times. But before penicillin, which penicillin comes around as common treatment for diseases, is in 1942. Before that, and around, looks like in the early 1900s, they would take patients that had syphilis and they would inject them with actual infected blood or malaria-infected blood, and they would inject this into patients. Sometimes an IM injection, sometimes IV, but the patients would actually develop malaria. And the awesome thing about malaria is that it has a very, very high fever oftentimes. And this high fever is so high, in fact, that the syphilis disease cannot survive in such high temperatures. So you give the patient malaria to kill their syphilis and then treat the malaria with a drug called quinine, which is actually, I believe, is still the same drug that they actually use to treat it today, more or less.
Now, I will say that although this sounds completely crazy, syphilis in this period will kill you.
Yeah.
100%. You're going to die from this. There are no antibiotics.
Mm-mm.
You are not coming back
Yeah,
from
this is
it.
pre-antibiotic world.
So you're talking about a drastic Hail Mary pass to
Right.
cure this disease that is going to kill you.
Mhm. And they basically they would infect you with the malaria, and they would not treat the malaria until your neurologic symptoms of syphilis resolved, and then they would start you on the quinine therapy. So this was actually developed by Dr. Julius Warner Jahreg, and he won a Nobel Prize as well in 1917 for this therapy because it was such a good idea. And while I didn't look to dig for any data on the successes versus the mortality. I did see that in 1920, syphilis is very, very high on the list of causes of death.
Yeah, it's very significant.
Right. In fact, it got Al Capone, not bullets, not all that gangster stuff. Syphilis got him, which is kind of strange to think. Syphilis and tax evasion, none of the gangster stuff. But it just struck me as odd to use one disease to cure another. And more importantly, a very, very deadly and high mortality rate disease to treat another high killing disease. I don't know. So it's just struck me as odd. One of the ways I thought about this in terms of gaming was, I guess it could be in any world. It would make more sense in a medieval or fantasy world, but
Give your players syphilis.
well, no, but not even necessarily that. But I thought about more of it using in terms of using one disease to cure another. And lycanthropy is a great disease to use because it's transmitted by bite, sort of like rabies, or even you could use the blood if you wanted to. But what if you had some strange plague affecting everyone, right? Like the blue pox or something, and you had a doctor or healer of sorts that was just injecting people with lycanthropy
Oh, nice.
and infecting everyone with whatever flavor of lycanthropy you want, whether that's were-rats or werewolves or whatever. And now you have all of these were-creatures and lycanthropes running around killing and murdering and causing problems all over the countryside. But as it turns out, it was started from a place of, altruism, like, oh, I've got to save my family, and this weird kind of thing. How do you deal with the person who's causing this infection to happen? All the drama, because obviously you're going to have this dealing with the curse of lycanthropy and putting down the werewolves or curing them, however you choose to go about doing that, and then finding out that it was actually an individual that was causing this problem and starting them to do all this kind of stuff. And what do you do with that person? Are they even, maybe what do you do with them even if they're not even infected? Maybe they're just completely immune. They never infected themselves. They did it as a treatment to cure their loved ones maybe. And how do you go about doing treating that, or how do you take care of that guy? Do you just off him? Do you imprison him? Do you let him go? I thought it created a cool kind of a cool moral conundrum.
Morally gray area.
Yeah, exactly. Because I'm a big fan of morally gray games, in case you haven't realized that from like the way that I talk about things. But I like to present my players with hard choices where there is no good answer. There's one that's gray and there's another one that's gray, and you can debate which one is grayer, I suppose. But I think that's a fun problem to present to your players, and I think it works in a cool way, where most games where you have lycanthropy running amok, it's just find the sources and put them down, essentially, right? What if there's somebody that's actually did this because they solved the plague and that's why they did it? So
You see that a lot in with vampirism.
yeah,
About, okay, well, I can't cure you, so I'm going to make you a vampire so
Right.
that you don't die.
mm-hmm.
But then you also have the terrible, terrible something going wrong with that, where whatever, 1 in 1,000, now I'm a vampire and I still have this disease. So there's a flaw for that. And so now everyone you feed off of, you've given whatever syphilis to, or
Right on. For those of you that aren't familiar with the World of Darkness, there's an entire vampire bloodline called the Lamia, or Lamia, however you want to say that were guardians of the Cappadocian clan, and their clan curses that they spread disease when they feed off of people if their victim doesn't die, and they are said to be the source of the Black Plague, and that their feeding indiscriminately is what made the Black Plague run amok, and because of that, they destroyed an entire bloodline, essentially. So there's a lot of potential there for a lot of different genres of game. I mean, you could easily take this into a sci-fi world. That kind of a concept where you're using one thing that is bad to cure another thing is essentially what you're doing. And I think it's just a kind of a cool idea. And you could even do it to where maybe you have players that are good, right? You have your clerics, your good cleric characters, or your paladins, and they get infected with some incurable disease, the blue pox or whatever. And the only way to cure them is to use this to give them lycanthropy. And then eventually maybe we can try and remove the curse from you or whatever, right? There's always some way to remove the second disease, but the second disease is going to be terrible and bad in maybe kind of a moral conundrum kind of a way.
My probably favorite example of this in like recent cultural, whatever, pop culture, is the American Horror Story, the hotel one, where his wife is a vampire now and she's a doctor and she has a young patient who's probably, I don't know, 9 or 10 who has measles because his mom doesn't get him vaccinated. Anyway, so he ends up, basically he's going to die from these measles. So she makes him a vampire.
And the fallout of that.
But basically, she just intends to give him her blood in hopes that it will cure him, and doesn't think about the consequences of him becoming a vampire and all these other things that might happen. She just thinks, oh, this is going to fix him.
And it does.
And it does. And then he goes to the school. He turns all the other kids into vampires. They murder all the adults. They have a very Lord of the Flies situation. And the whole thing spirals out of control from this one, like, innocent, I want to help gesture.
Want to do good. Yeah.
This mountain of good intentions crumbles down.
And you could even do that with my fantasy example. Maybe your person who's trying to cure people doesn't infect a lot of people. Maybe he affects 1 or 2 that are his immediate family. And then it just goes out of control from there. Right. And always trying to cover up and hide for his family, to make sure that they don't get in trouble for murdering people. That one was my favorite. That's why I saved it for last. I thought it was very cool.
That's a good one.
Well, do you have anything else to say about incorporating weird, funky treatments into your games?
I don't know. Do you have any honorable mentions, like things you looked at that maybe didn't quite make the list?
I think Frankenstein is an easy choice for, like, it's not obviously a real thing, but there is a cool period in the late 1800s and early 1900s about where they discover electricity and human bodies and how nerves and muscles still work. Yeah, that's a really cool, easy kind of a gimme. If you watch Penny Dreadful, there's a fair amount of that in there with Dr. Frankenstein, and it's just something that's really common in anything. That one was a really cool one. Do you have any?
I think probably my honorable mention would go to forced sterilization. I think that's a pretty terrifying one, especially when you're talking about like if you're doing a feminine horror style game.
Right.
Because in that time period, you're looking at if a woman is a bad wife, like if she's too promiscuous or she's a spinster or
yeah,
you can just remove her ability to have children without her consent, and I think that is a very terribly intriguing thing to play with in that style of game.
Right. One that we didn't mention, it just occurred to me now, actually, is the Tuskegee experiment.
I was gonna talk about that when you were talking about the syphilis, and that's
a very dark one. Yeah,
it's in like the 1960s.
Yeah, so it's after
it's late. It's 20 years after penicillin comes around, and after it's been used as a primary treatment for syphilis
and successfully used as a treatment.
And then you add in
do you want to introduce what it is for people that don't know?
Okay, so if you had to pick it's got to be one of the top 5 most shameful things in the history of medical research.
Right.
So there is this thing called the Tuskegee experiment. And so what happens is that this group of individuals that they're experimenting on has syphilis, and they're kind of basically studying them to see how the syphilis advances.
Mm-hmm. They're all poor, black.
Yeah, they're all African-American males.
Right.
And I mean, in that time period, most of them
as well. Isn't that where it's at?
I don't recall.
It's somewhere in the South. So
basically, there's some kind of incentive for them joining this experiment. Maybe it's a few dollars or whatever. It's not a lot. So they have all been infected with syphilis. They're studying them. They're seeing how the syphilis progresses into the late stages and up even to death.
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, since they start this experiment, because the stages of syphilis to progress through takes a while. It's not like a couple of weeks. You're talking about like a couple of years before you die from this. Penicillin becomes a valid treatment and a common treatment for curing syphilis. So they know this, And instead of treating these patients that they know have syphilis, they go ahead and continue the experiment
Mm-hmm.
to see what it will happen to these
happens.
individuals when they're not treated.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they die and terrible things happen to them. And in the meantime, basically, word gets out about this, and they make a new set of like laws, moral codes that have to be followed as a result of the fallout from this terrible thing.
That result in changes to medical research, essentially, right?
Right. Yeah. Changes in medical research.
Now, do they
practices.
actually? I don't remember because I'm all recalling this from memory of reading it, quite a while ago from classes and stuff. But did they infect the patients, or did they come in already infected?
I think they came in already
Okay.
infected with the syphilis.
Because that's another level of sinister if you take patients and you knowingly infect them with something, and then
But there are laws now that basically say if there is nothing else to be gained from this study and there is a valid treatment, which if you withhold it will have negative consequences on that patient's outcomes, you're not allowed to do that. And
Right.
if in the course of the study you discover that this treatment is without doubt the best thing that this patient can have, then you have to offer it to
Right.
them if they are a part of that study.
right. So that one's not exactly related to mental health, but it is very definitely related to the medical field.
Terrible medical ethics is what that's related to.
Yeah. So there's a lot of black marks, or however you like. There's a lot of darkness in a lot of medical research, especially the further back you go. But I think you'd be surprised how dark it is not going very far back.
Yeah.
You would think
It's
that you would
not
have to
that
go
far away.
further back than that, but the 60s are pretty dark in a lot of time, in a lot of spots, the 50s, the 40s, and it just continues to get worse as you go back. So while not a bright time in the history of medical ethics or anything like that, there is a lot of inspiration to be drawn from in there to add horror elements to your game, or well, I guess, yeah, it's just horror pretty much, really. There's not a whole lot of other things to take from that. Right on. I think that'll probably do it for this one. Kind of
And on a high note,
a
there.
darker note there, but not to make light of any of these, but they're just like anything with a good movie. They take inspiration from a lot of places, and sometimes those are darker places. But in doing that research and learning about those things, you'd be surprised at what ideas that sparks in you. And also it makes you realize things have changed for the better, I guess, really, to kind of lighten it up a little bit, that we've come a long way in terms of medical ethics and medical technology and whatnot. So,
And when you're talking about putting these in games, I would encourage people to you don't have to take just this base thing like, okay, well, a lobotomy is a terrible thing, so I'm going to throw that in there. Really look at what about that procedure gives you that sort of skin crawling
right.
feeling. Like, what is it? What agency are you taking away from the person that makes this such a terrible experience? And focus on that idea and amplifying that idea.
Right. That's exactly right. Like, I think sometimes it's a little ham-fisted in a way to take some of these treatments directly and apply them straight into your game. But if you're using them in terms of like inspiration, like with the lycanthropy thing, right, or the feeding farms from Blade or whatever, right, that there's a lot of cool horror aspects to take from that and to incorporate those, because I think some of those, when you find, if you use different sources of inspiration to draw on those horror elements from, that you will surprise your players. Because I find in all the things that we have done, in all the horror games that we've ran and haunted houses that we've been involved with and all this stuff that we've done, it's harder and harder to scare people now because movies and special effects are so good and there's so much information out there that when you can draw from different sources and apply them in kind of different ways, that I think you'll find that you might actually touch on some real moments of horror in your games, if that's what you're looking for.
And there are
And-
some solid ideas that are always going to be scary. So the idea of loss of autonomy, the idea of isolation, the idea of things done without your consent, like those are core concepts that are always going to be bothersome to people if
Right.
you poke them the right way.
Right. And at the same time, when you're running a horror game, make sure you know your players. Don't push too far, I guess. And I've come around to the idea that we mentioned quite a while back about the stoplight idea on your table if
Such
you
a
need to
good idea.
for a horror game, specifically with your red light, yellow light, green light for what is okay and what is not okay. And just, know your players. Make sure you don't push too far. In our cases, at our table, sometimes I like to be pushed that way. Those things I think that are scary are really, really creepy. We had a great Degenesis game where I know Carrie got weirded out, and I think you were pretty creeped out by bugs going into people's mouths and whatnot, just in a really creepy kind of way, because there's a lot of untapped resources out there. A lot of the horror tropes are pretty overdone, but there are some of them that are really good that are not used very often. So get out there, stretch your legs, watch some different movies, find some different inspiration, and creep your players out because it's pretty awesome. All right. Well, in addition to listening to our awesome podcast for great gaming inspiration and
Sage-like wisdom.
Yeah, that sounds good. You guys should head over to and listen to the Starling Tribune on the episode, the most recent episode 167, CW Seeds Vixen. It looks like the Starling Tribune reporters Stargate Pioneer Chris and Michelle discuss the CW Seed animated series Vixen. The trio discuss how great a Supergirl Vixen crossover would be in an animated series, how important it is to wear goggles when flying with your superpowers, that travel in Vixen is one of the series' superpowers, and debate on hashtag Berlantraverse versus hashtag Arrowverse. And Chris and Michelle teach SP what a totem is. So head over there and check out the crossover debate there with Supergirl and Vixen, and should be a good time. And as always, you guys can find us online by, oh, wait 1 second. I almost forgot.
2 very enthusiastic thumbs up.
Before I forget, we wanted to give a couple shout outs here. We got several reviews on iTunes. So the ones that have left comments and I can see, give a quick shout out to them. So big thank you to Fulzem. I think I'm saying that right. Fulzem. Handles are kind of hard to figure out how to say them. So they say, good stuff, 5 stars. By tabletop gamers for tabletop games, this podcast is well produced and nicely moderated. The hosts know gaming and games. Highly recommended. So big thank you to Fulzem. That's pretty high praise in my mind for us.
Nice.
So right on. Big thank you to him or her, I suppose. I don't know. And as well, big thank you, nerds. 5 stars. Love these guys. 5 stars. Exclamation point. So short, sweet, to the point.
Ooh, I like the exclamation point.
Yeah, exactly. So big thank you to them for taking the time to give us a review. It helps us boost us up in the ratings. So if you guys head over and give us a review, we'll give you a shout out on the podcast. Big thank you to those guys for doing that and taking the time to help share us with someone else. So as always, thank you for your guys' support and listening to us. As always, you can find us on Twitter at JustOneMoreFix or online at JustOneMoreFix.com. And you can get a hold of me at James at JustOneMoreFix. And you can support us by heading over to iTunes, Google Play, Libsyn, wherever you get your podcast from, and giving us a review and a comment there. But the best way you can help us out is by sharing us with somebody that you know that doesn't listen to us and is a gamer or might want to become a gamer, and letting them know about us. And I think that will do it for this week. So until next week, another horror episode coming up then, some horror inspirations.
I really need to enunciate horror.
Horror?
better.
I say, that sound like horror? Horror?
Yeah.
Horror?
Sometimes I'm
Horror.
really not hearing the difference.
Right on. Okay. And next week we should have another horror episode coming out to you guys, as well as a review of Bluebeard's Bride. Other than that, I guess we will see you guys next week.
Later.
Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of Just One More Fix. Music has been provided by Kevin MacLeod. You can find him at incompetech.com. You can find us at justonemorefix.com and follow us on Twitter at JustOneMoreFix.